Congressman Steve Russell.
Well, joining me on the panel today, I'm privileged, are Governor Jim Gilmore and Mr. David Sid. Governor Gilmore, who you heard from earlier, served as the Attorney General of Virginia and then its governor, serving as governor from 1998 to 2002. He is a graduate of the Law School of the University of Virginia. He is an Army veteran and served as the U.S. Army counterintelligence agent. From 1999 to 2003, Governor Gilmore chaired the Congressional Advisory Panel to assess domestic capabilities for terrorism involving weapons of mass destruction, usually called the Gilmore Commission. From January 2001 to January 2002, he chaired the Republican National Committee. Currently, he is the president and CEO of the Free Congress Foundation. Also on the panel today is Mr. David Sid, no stranger to Oklahoma, a retired FBI agent and the current director of the Homeland Security Institute at Rose State College. He is the retired executive director of the Memorial Institute for the Prevention of Terrorism. A 20-year veteran of the FBI, he has served as a counterterrorism specialist and was a member of the FBI International Crisis Response Team and Special Weapons Tactics Teams. He is a veteran of the Vietnam War. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Governor Gilmore and Mr. Sid. We've never seen, that I recall in my lifetime, a more volatile Middle East, where each country that it seems in the region is dusted up by some type of use of arms on their border. And now we see ideological fights that are spreading even to our own borders, whereas before you might have had people that were angry at the government and you would have domestic criminal acts. Now we're seeing people that are inspired by foreign ideology very similar to communism. Governor Gilmore, I wonder if you might comment on some of the foreign aspects of that this morning.
Congressman, thank you. And you know, this guy was an Army Ranger. Did y'all know that? I guess all three of us up here have military service. I was in the Army intelligence in Europe myself. And as the Congressman said, chairman of the National Commission on Homeland Security. You know, Congressman, to answer it, I want to start by putting it very quickly into a framework, and I made a couple of notes. I think we have to understand strategically that we're facing a whole new challenge to America today. We've always had these challenges of nation states challenging us, as we do with Russia and China and even Iran. And now we have an international guerrilla war going on that we've called the war on terror. Terror is really a tactic, not an actual entity, but it's being used by people who are not connected necessarily to any nation state. And as a result, what we are really seeing today is people who want to upset the entire world order. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing on the borders in the Middle East and on our own borders. There are people that don't want to abide by American values. And I think that instead of this pull back, withdraw, pull back type of foreign policy and national security policy we're seeing from the Obama administration and would see from the Clinton administration. We need a new foreign policy, a conservative internationalism. We need a new foreign policy that relies upon liberty and upon diplomacy armed by force, so that any opponent that is dealing with us and negotiating with us knows that we can back it up with genuine American power and a strong economy, a strong Navy, a strong military. In order for what purpose? Why? Because we are the guardians of Western civilization and culture. That's what we are as Americans. That is the role that history has made for us. And what are those values that we have to defend? Democracy and freedom, the free enterprise system, the rule of law, the freedom of faith, so that we can worship the way we want and not impose it on anyone else, and certainly not have anyone impose their faith on us. And finally, the advancement of women. All of these values are under attack in the world today, and we are the guardians on the ramparts of freedom. And that's why we're having these challenges.
Well, we certainly are, and I think even our domestic law enforcement now may be the first thing that stands between a horrific act of terror and not. Whereas before we've relied on our militaries to safeguard our shores. With this ideological fight, we're seeing some real problems. But we fought ideologies before. In 1917, we didn't take communism too seriously. By 1930, we began to think maybe it might be a problem. By 1948, you saw President Truman develop a doctrine to contain it. And then in 1988 and 89, we saw the fruit of Ronald Reagan's strategy to see its end. I think we're in for the long haul as we look at how these ideologies seep into acts of terror domestically. And David, would you make a comment about how these ideologies can play and how that differs maybe from some of the other types of domestic terror we've seen before?
Certainly. As Americans, we have always valued liberty over security, and so we're vulnerable to terrorism. When we have groups like ISIS sending people who have been on the battlefield, who have been shot at and shot back, and have a high capacity for violence and a tolerance for uncertainty as well, they send them back here trained, we have problems. We've done a good job of preventing terrorism since 9/11. With few exceptions, the FBI has done a sterling job, really. But most of the people they faced were amateurs. Now we're facing the professionals. And this is important because the way we detect terrorism domestically is through the identification of suspicious activity. Those are the mistakes the terrorists make pre-operationally. Our entire system depends upon the terrorists making mistakes. The fewer mistakes a professional makes, the less likely we are to get them. So I think we're facing a very, very, very perilous time right now.
And we've really got to offer the alternatives of what it is, as you had mentioned, Governor, about what is it that makes Americans unique, the rule of law, and why that's so important. We see those with some of these ideologies, especially with Islamic jihadism. And yes, I will say it, it needs to be said, it is a real global threat. That's not to say that Islam is always that way. I've certainly been deployed in Islamic countries before and have many great friends that are there in difficult circumstances. And we admire the leadership of people like President Sisi in Egypt right now and King Abdullah of Jordan and the leadership that they're demonstrating. But it goes broader. If we do not have a foreign policy that contains this type of ideology, it's no longer dealing with national states and looking at them as civil strife within those states. We have to develop a comprehensive strategy that goes after it beyond those borders and then be willing to act without taking an opinion poll to see what's right. And would you care to comment on that?
Well, that's for sure. What is at work here is an international movement that wants to upset the world order. They don't want an American nation state that stands for liberty and freedom and has the borders and the sovereignty and the finance and the ability with an economy to stand up for Western values. They not only don't want an American nation, they don't want any nations. They want to break this thing down into an international caliphate that then takes this medieval philosophy and tries to extend it across the world. Something they can't do, but think of the damage and the danger and the destruction they will do while we're dealing with it. But we must be resolute and prepared to deal with this as we go along. But the challenges are new. Now look, we've got a very serious challenge now against the Russians. They're back. My old friends I was a Cold War intelligence agent, and they're back. The Chinese are an entirely new thing. The Iranians definitely want a nuclear weapon, and we've got an agreement here that lets them have it after 10 years. Is that the kind of agreement that we really ought to be settling for in the world today? So you got those problems. But then this guerrilla war is in something entirely new, and the congressman is right. We need a new strategy for this. This is very dangerous. This is the ability to use our modern developments against us. Our reliance on computers to create cyber attacks. our reliance on transportation to hijacked airplanes, our reliance on modern finance, all the elements of modernity they are using against us. And that is the strategy that we have to begin to create. But I can tell you this, Congressman, you're not going to get it under this leadership in Washington that we're seeing right now.
I'm trying to think of one foreign policy success that we've seen in the last 5 years, and I can't, which is why I'm very concerned when we grant the president certain powers outside of Congress to formulate deals. As you mentioned, we had Iran. We certainly want to check on him, and we want congressional power to be used. So I think some of the things you've seen in recent weeks is Congress struggling to reinsert ourselves into that process, and we have to pay careful attention to it. One of the interesting things that you see with regard to our domestic terror challenges is how law enforcement would respond to it. I think the terrorists win if we militarize our police force. And I'm going to make some controversial statements here. We want our law enforcement well equipped and able to respond to any need, but we don't want them in camouflage fatigues. All three of us are military veterans here. We don't want them performing military-like duties where we become and look like a police state. It's very important that we stay looking free. We should not look like tyrants and communist countries or oppressive countries as we struggle to put together law enforcement responses. We shouldn't show up in tanks. We shouldn't point rifles at American citizens simply because they're assembling. We point them at criminals, yes, that are in the act of something and when there's great danger, but we don't view through our scopes trying to intimidate crowds. And I think that we have to be very, very careful that we don't trample our liberty in trying to protect it. Now, David, you spent years in law enforcement. Would you care to comment on the balance between needing to be able to respond? You were involved with SWAT teams and the other things with the FBI. What's the balance? And what do we need to be careful of? And then what should we be more vigilant on?
Well, as Americans, we're always balancing liberty and security. It's in constant readjustment. But we have to be very careful about what liberties we surrender, because typically when we surrender liberty, we don't get it back. So it's very, very important that we be careful what we're willing to give up. As I said, Americans are always choosing liberty over security. We always have. And so we remain vulnerable to terrorism. But we have to be careful what liberties we surrender.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And on that note, really our first line of defense has always been we, the people. It always will be. I think the right of self-defense, the right to be secure in our property, the right that we have, that these are inalienable rights, not granted by government, but they're God-given. And as we look at that balance, that we're able to see how do we protect our communications, but at the same time allow intercepts, fight the cybersecurity war, deal with those struggling issues that we kind of make us uncomfortable. We want to intercept the act of terror, but we're not sure where to draw the line. Would you care to comment some on that, Governor?
Well, let me say two things very, very quickly in the little time that I've got. Number one, as chairman of the Advisory National Commission on Terrorism and Homeland Security for the United States, we addressed these issues of the use of the military in the homeland. In fact, I insisted that one of the principal issues we addressed was whether or not and how you use the military in the homeland. And my position was always you don't use the military in the homeland. It's very dangerous to do.
I would agree.
Instead, we rely upon people like Mr. Sid and others. I believe that, frankly, our police are under assault today. I think that there's been not every officer is a good guy all the time or does the right thing all the time, but by and large, they're all that stands between us and chaos in this country. So there's, in my view, on your issue, there's nothing quite so powerful as a uniformed police officer with the badge of his authority in the community, because it projects there the rule of law, the legitimacy of the state, and the fact that we are going to have a civilized society. So I concur with that. On the direct issue of surveillance, I remember when one of the introductory letters I did in our commission, you can go back and look at it, it's on the webpage. I said that if the enemy is able to make us give up our liberties, as Mr. Sid said, there's always this balance, but if they can make us give up our liberties in return for security, then they will have won. And we're not for that. We can't allow that to happen in this modern challenge and engagement that we're in right now. Listen, we've got troubles ahead. Because of modernity and the ability to use modern weaponry and communications and travel, it would be ideal, almost obvious, that we should be attacked in this country. And we have to empower people of goodwill and good faith, like the FBI and our local police, to be able to protect us, while at the same time making sure that there is such close oversight that our privacies are not inhibited. And people would say this is a zero-sum game. They would make you choose. The enemy wants to make us choose. I say that we find ways to have liberty and freedom and security at the same time, and that's the challenge that we're facing today.
And as we face that, you know, in our closure here, it's hard to open up such weighty discussions in a short amount of time, but it's important that we bring these issues to the fore. They ought to be the subject of your coffee talks. They ought to be the subject of your water cooler discussions or as you mingle with friends, because we are the first line of defense of our liberties, we the people. And how we interact with one another, again, working on teams, not dividing our resources, not dividing ourselves, but rather trying to stand to solve problems and then be vigilant, paying attention. There was a major, I was in Germany recently, and a major terrorist act that was intercepted simply because a lady reported something unusual at a marketplace. God bless her. You could be that first line of defense. Well, thank you for our panelists, and thank you for your attention here today on these very important issues. God bless you all.